Thank you very much. So, in a lecture recital about saxophone vibrato, you might find it strange that we began the evening with a piece with no vibrato whatsoever. But trust me, this has its purpose. In 1866, when the Fantasy by Emery was composed, it's thought that not only on the saxophone, but in many wind instruments, vibrato was deemed fairly inappropriate. For this reason, many people think that saxophonists from this era, when the saxophone really was in its infancy as a concert instrument, many people think that saxophonists did not use vibrato at all. This sentiment is incredibly difficult to prove or not, because obviously no recordings exist from the middle of the 19th century. However, we can look to some writings for clues on if saxophonists use vibrato or not. If we look at some major pedagogical studies and saxophone methods composed or authored in the 19th century, like those by Kastner, Koken, Mayer, and Closet, there's actually no mention of vibrato whatsoever in these method books, so maybe they didn't use it. The first possible comment on any kind of thing that could resemble vibrato comes in Carl Weber's 1897 method, where he describes the ideal saxophone sound as unwavering. So again, it's looking like less and less likely that saxophonists use vibrato in this period. If we fast forward even further and go into the 20th century, we really see some negative comments about vibrato. This is a quote from Ben Veriken's Foundation to Saxophone Playing, a major saxophone method written in 1917. He says in the section called What to Practice, he says, avoid the tremolo or vibrato style of playing. See that your tone is absolutely clear and pure. We also see this in the 1920 method book by George Collar. He says, avoid any semblance to tremolo or vibrato, almost the same exact statement. So it is clear from, at least from a pedagogical standpoint, that saxophone vibrato in the first several decades of its existence was probably deemed inappropriate and probably not used, and maybe even in poor taste. Yet, we know from the recorded history of classical saxophone greats such as Sigurd Rascher and Marcel Mühl that vibrato became an integral, if not fundamental, part of the classical saxophone sound. Therefore, how can we get from no vibrato whatsoever to lots of vibrato in the case of people like Marcel Mühl in the French school? And more importantly, how do we approach playing vibrato on saxophone as modern players if our history of our instrument illustrates such a stark contrast? It's difficult to argue Marcel Mühl's vibrato, for instance, is in poor taste. Yet hopefully, just a second ago, we provide an example of an acceptable classical saxophone performance that had no vibrato whatsoever. So you have this huge, huge contrast, and anything in between can be deemed acceptable. So maybe the better question to ask is for how to approach vibrato is not if we should use vibrato or how much, but maybe why we should even use vibrato. For this, I suggest we step away from the saxophone world and examine maybe more the historical attitude towards vibrato, and from this we can get an entirely different perspective and a new approach to our own saxophone vibrato. Through the examination of many historical documents and treatises, most musicologists have come to the consensus that vibrato, from a historical sense, was treated much more like an ornament than we treat it today. By the word ornament, let's be clear, I mean something that's more of an enhancement or an addition to, not something fundamental. In fact, many musicologists consider vibrato in pre-modern music to be part of the shake family, along with other ornaments like the trill, the mordent, or the tremolo. Some authors has even described modern vibrato as just a degenerated descendant of the trill, so coming from a different area than what we probably consider modern vibrato. We can go directly to some treatises for evidence of this. This is a quote from Silvestro Ganassi in his viol treatise of 1542. He says, at times one trembles with the bow arm and with the fingers of the hand around the neck in order to achieve an expression appropriate for sad, aggrieved music. The key areas here are, he says, at times one trembles, showing that it's does not use continuously, and he talks about using it to enhance certain emotions. Again, not maybe part of the fundamental sound, definitely an ornament. Another quote we have from Johann Friedrich Agricola in 1757 in his vocal treatise, he calls intentional vibrato, he calls it bebung, the same word we use to describe the ornamental vibrato on the clavichord. Now, if we want to look at treatises from more of a wind instrument perspective, we can look at the flute treatises of Hotteterre in 1707 and Quantz in 1752. In each of these, the only vibrato described is finger vibrato, which generally cannot be achieved continuously, therefore must be reserved for special places, hence ornamentation. So all this evidence kind of mounts up and shows that the attitude towards vibrato is quite different than what we have today. In this modern age of historically informed performances and historically accurate performances, it may come as no surprise that vibrato is one of the differences in a lot of pre-modern music, because when you go hear an historically accurate performance of Baroque or Renaissance music, you're likely to hear completely different vibrato styles. One of the things that's generally used to differentiate that music from modern music, along with playing on period instruments. But it's less common to hear romantic music or music from the 19th century performed differently than in our modern approach. But actually, many musicologists consider that vibrato didn't really come into its own, as, at least on wind instruments, until the very end of the 19th century, and really didn't have widespread use until actually the 1930s. This may come as a surprise, like it did to me when I read this. If you listen to recordings of the late Romantic violinist Joseph Joachim, which he did make some in the late 1890s and the 1900s, he really only used vibrato for emphasis and on certain long notes, not as a continuous sound like we hear with some modern violinists, or most modern violinists. Even for vocalists we consider generally picked up vibrato before wind instrument or instrumentalists did, but even for them, there's evidence that certain 19th century composers would write specific places in vocal scores for vocalists to use vibrato at this point. This shows that maybe not all of them used it continuously, even in the middle of the Romantic period. Going back to the saxophone world, one of the landmark saxophone methods from the early stages of saxophone development comes in 1908, the universal method for the saxophone by Paul DeVille. In it, he just generally gives a definition for vibrato. He calls it a wavering tone effect, which should be sparingly used. So here we have, it's an effect, sparingly used, not continuous, not at all like the French school of the middle 20th century. The notion that vibrato was only considered an ornament is really not shared by all of the musicologists who study earlier forms of music. Some people believe that many early musicologists and things like that consider vibrato a natural phenomenon, which would contradict this ornamental approach. If you look at a quote from Michael Pretorius in 1619, he's talking about some exceptional choir boys. He says they were well endowed by God and nature with an especially beautiful, vibrant, and flowing or quivering voice. Some things we can take from this. He's saying here that vibrato is not learned. It is natural, coming from God or nature. So it must not be an embellishment or an ornament in this case. It is actually part of their singing. So here we see an historical account of something that's quite different from the ornamental vibrato. Big quote that is often referenced in this kind of debate I'm talking about is from Leopold Mozart in his seminal violin treatise in 1755. He says, the tremolo, sometimes we consider tremolo maybe the same thing as vibrato in earlier forms of music. The tremolo is an embellishment which arises from nature itself and which can be employed artistically in long notes, not only by good instrumentalists, but by skillful singers. Nature herself is the teacher in this art, for if we strike a loose string or bell sharply, we are apt to beat a certain wave-like cadence of the given tone. And this quivering sound one calls tremolo, or also the tremulant. One also attempts to imitate this natural quivering on string instruments, specifically talking about the violin here. Here, Leopold Mozart does refer to it as an embellishment, which maybe can mean it's more ornamental, but he does talk about it coming from nature. So a point to really recognize here. Another thing that we must notice about this one that would become a common theme is Mozart talks about instrumentalists imitating the natural vibrato of, say, striking a bell or of vocalists. This is another quote from Francesco Gimignani that also echoes this sentiment of instrumentalists imitating vocalists. He says the art of playing the violin consists in giving that instrument a tone that shall in a manner rival the most perfect human voice. And maybe the most important quote has all to do with this. It is referenced countless times over that sprung an entire debate about what vibrato was in pre-modern music. It comes from Mozart himself. In a letter he wrote to his father in 1778, he says, "The human voice trembles naturally, but in its own way, and only to such a degree that the effect is beautiful. Such is the nature of the voice, and people imitate it not only on wind instruments, but also on string instruments, and even the clavichord." So here he's giving you everything. It's a natural phenomenon, especially in the voice, and instruments should imitate it. This claim by Mozart that the human voice specifically vibrates naturally, or that vibrato is a natural phenomenon in the singing voice, has led to much debate, not only among early music historians, but among modern vocal pedagogues who are trying to better understand how the human vocal mechanism operates. If you ask almost any fully developed singer, they will tell you it's difficult to sing a perfectly straight tone and sustain a straight pitch. Generally, this can only be achieved by singing with a pressed or breathy tone quality, techniques which have been deemed improper or even unhealthy for a modern vocalist, because it generally requires a higher level of muscular tension to sing with a straight quality. Why is this? Well, according to some recent scientific studies, when a voice sustains a pitch, there's a series of irregular nerve pulses originating in the brain, which cause muscular tremors in the larynx to occur between generally 5 to 8 times per second. If these tremors, if the vocal folds are making the correct amount of contact, these tremors will kind of develop into subtle, natural vibrato. Hence, vibrato is actually an indication of proper vocal technique. Other people have deemed vibrato natural in the singing voice because it helps with things like eliminating vocal fatigue, especially at louder dynamic levels. Like almost all muscles in the human body, the larynx works best when there are a series of relaxations and contractions. Vibrato also allows more airflow. Some people have supposed maybe about 10% more airflow with a note held with vibrato versus a straight tone. This is because when a singer tries to keep their natural vibrato from oscillating, there's too much glottal resistance, and it keeps the airflow from happening correctly. Although there's much evidence that we've been talking about that supports the notion that vibrato may be a natural phenomenon in the singing voice, the degree to which a voice vibrates naturally is definitely in question still. Many people consider what modern vocalists, what you hear them doing, is a pretty big exaggeration from what should actually happen naturally, and that true natural vibrato is actually fairly narrow and unobtrusive. There's actually evidence in the historical side of things also. If we go back and re-examine Mozart's quote that we just looked at, we can actually see that he's speaking about a vocalist who he didn't necessarily like their vibrato. So let's open up this quote and look at what he said before and after what we just read. Mozart says, "Meissner, as you know, has the bad habit of making his voice tremble at times, and this I never could endure in him. And really, it is a detestable habit and quite contrary to nature." And here's what we've already seen. The human voice trembles naturally, but in its own way, and only to such a degree that the effect is beautiful. such is the nature of the voice, and people imitate it not only on wind instruments, but also on string instruments and even the clavichord. And he goes on to say, but the moment the proper limit is overstepped, it is no longer beautiful. Because it is contrary to nature, it reminds me of jolting the organ bellows. So it's clear from this that Mozart recognizes a pretty big difference between what he thinks would be natural vibrato and what he thinks is intentional vibrato, and clearly prefers one over the other. There's also some evidence in some early vocal pedagogy or teaching of the voice. A quote from Daniel Frederici in 1649. He says, talking about choir boys again, he says, from the beginning the boys should form the voice in a naturally beautiful manner, and where possible, with a delicate trembling, wavering, or quivering in the throat. Again, this is referring to maybe a form of natural vibrato, but again, he uses the word delicate, something subtle. There's also evidence in instrumental pedagogy from maybe the 17th century, where some authors have supposed that teachers would tell their instrumental students to imitate the unnoticeable vibrato of the fine singer. So again, calling vibrato unnoticeable, delicate, these are things that lend themselves towards subtlety, maybe not what we hear in our modern vocalists and even instrumentalists. The counter-argument to a lot of this is that, well, many people say that early forms of music used no vibrato continuously, maybe added some for special effects and ornamentation, but they say that things like pure intervallic intonation, hearing the pure intervals, and the clarity of contrapuntal lines was held to a very, very high level of importance in early forms of music. So vibrato kind of ruins this. But some studies, some recent studies have shown that if the vibrato is subtle enough, and what we're talking about, this kind of natural vibrato, then pure intervallic intonation and contrapuntal lines can clearly be heard. So maybe this is a counter-argument to that. In summary, the approach to vibrato from a historical sense generally has been that maybe there's a natural vibrato that can be used continuously, yet a more exaggerated intentional vibrato should be reserved for ornamentation. Nevertheless, the majority of recorded music history or music from the 20th century shows that vibrato in all forms of music basically was used a little different than this. This change likely began to happen in the late 19th century. The first edition of the New Grove Dictionary, which is published between 1878 and 1889, says that vibrato was a device that could be used to add color to a melodic shape, enhance expressive notes, or assist in cantabile playing. Here we see that while vibrato maybe is still considered more of an ornament, its use in a variety of situations is definitely increasing at this time. Other people suppose that the rise of a more prominent vibrato comes about because concert halls and orchestras and choirs and operas and everything became louder and larger in the mid to late 19th century. And the vocalists needed a way to stand out from the loud accompaniment. So audiences generally preferred the vocalists who had a more prominent vibrato because they were able to cut through the sound without necessarily having to sing louder. This extensive training at these high dynamic levels and with a more and more prominent vibrato generally led to the formation of a more habitual, continuous vibrato, which only intensified into the 20th century. By the early 20th century, many instrumentalists had begun to copy their vocal counterparts by instilling what I like to call a more omnipresent vibrato and not just straight tone and then using maybe some vibrato for ornamentation. The string instruments likely first picked this up when this followed. And it was maybe from string instruments, especially violins, that saxophonists first got their vibrato styles from. In early 20th century dance orchestras, a lot of times there were large string sections. And once the saxophone started being more popular in the teens and 1920s, many of these violinists started to double on saxophone. And it's likely they used the same approach to playing for both instruments. So this could be a possible way that saxophonists first started incorporating vibrato into their playing. It was actually Rudy Wiedoeft who first talked about vibrato in a really positive way for the saxophone. He pointed out that it should emulate the human voice. So he may have gotten a lot of it also started. But it was definitely from Marcel Mule that we really got modern saxophone vibrato, at least on the classical side, as he rose to prominence in the 1930s. Marcel Mule started on violin first, so this could be part of where his approach to saxophone vibrato came from. But it also is very likely that it came from while he was playing in the Parisian 1920s jazz scene, which he would do for sidemen in addition to his classical playing. Apparently he first only used vibrato in jazz and used a pretty much straight tone in classical music. But in 1927 he was playing with the Paris Opera Comique, and the conductor asked him to incorporate some vibrato on some kind of jazz-inspired solos that were in the performance. Mule tried this out in rehearsal, and to his surprise, the conductor and his peers really received it favorably. And the story basically is that he tells us from this point forward, he incorporated a much more prominent and exaggerated vibrato in his classical playing, and this is what he really became known for. Mule's influence overall has been well documented. His solo career lasted from around 1925 to 1958. He toured much of Europe and the United States. He released over 20 recordings as a soloist, recording some of the most standard and recognizable of the classical saxophone repertoire, many of those pieces dedicated to him. He was also a pioneer of the saxophone quartet and its repertoire. But possibly Mule's most influential thing he did was his teaching. Before Marcel Mule, there really wasn't any prominent classical saxophone teachers at all. And so he had to draw upon outside sources to develop any kind of pedagogical foundation for the saxophone. By the time he was appointed the professor of saxophone at the Paris Conservatory in 1942, only the second person to ever achieve this, the first being Adolphe Sax himself. But by this time in 42, his influence was huge throughout the classical saxophone world. His students such as Daniel Defayet, Jean-Marie Landex, Frederick Hemke all went on to have highly influential saxophone studios of their own. By the time Mule retired in 1968, every single saxophonist or saxophone teacher that played classical or concert saxophone music in the entire world had been influenced some way by Marcel Mule. So with this huge level of influence on by Mule, it can be imagined that his style, his playing style, and especially his vibrato style, would become the dominant French saxophone style that kind of pervaded even the rest of the world. His vibrato was, most people agree, is generally wide, generally very prominent, and he played it on nearly every single note. This can actually be illustrated if you use a spectrogram analysis. This is an excerpt from his recording of Paul Creston's Sonata, the second movement. The red line you can see up here is the sound, and you can see vibrato on every single note. The smaller notes that you can see right here are eighth notes or even triplets. So he's using vibrato not just on the long notes, but on every single note. This illustrates that he's not thinking of vibrato as an ornament, he's thinking as a fundamental part of his saxophone sound. If we zoom in on one single note, we can actually look at some of his specific parameters of Mule's vibrato. Here's one single note, and you can see there's 7 full cycles of vibrato within this green box. And the duration was 1.25 seconds. Do a little math here. 7 divided by 1.25 is 5.6. This gives you his vibrato rate, 5.6 cycles per second. You can also look right here. This printout shows 74 cents is his pitch width. So around 3/4 of a half step is how wide his vibrato is as far as pitch goes. And I didn't pick this a particular note out that he used particularly wide vibrato on. This is a fairly indicative of Marcel Mule's playing. His pitch width was generally between 60 and 80 cents, and his vibrato rate, his oscillation rate, was generally between 5 and 6 per second. So to demonstrate this Marcel Mule's vibrato and in general the French style of vibrato, we're going to now play Pierre Lantier's Sicilian, which was composed in 1944, right in the middle of this kind of era of French saxophone. This piece was actually dedicated to Marcel Mule. And notice as we play this, the vibrato I'll be using is very, very continuous. It's very wide. I'm trying to go for between 60 and 80 cents. And it's not ornamental in any way, but it's also not the natural vibrato that we previously discussed because it's much too wide and too prominent.